First of all, it's an honor and a privilege to be here, and what's been important for me in this presentation and the discussions that we've heard is to think about how diversity, equity, and inclusion is a filter or a lens that you should be looking at in all of the things that you're doing. So the question that I pose to this audience, because you're technologists and you're HR professionals, is technology helping or is it hurting diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts? I think it's helping in some respects, but I'll also talk about how it's hurting. First of all, it gives everyone a chance. It sort of levels the playing fields in many ways, if done correctly. It connects everyone, as we heard about LinkedIn, we heard about Facebook. We see the various forms and ways and channels that people are communicating and sharing information and data about folks. And it makes it easier to be more flexible. How many of you telework sometime during the week? How many of you have flexible schedules? You don't show up at the same time. So it is creating a whole new environment and way in which people are working and building relationships and so forth. How does it hurt? Well, technology, and I'm focusing specifically on technology. There's a lot I could talk about in terms of diversity, but I think you already know it, and you've already heard some of it. And I will be building on some of what's already been said. But it can be designed to build in bias or take it out. So you have to think about, is your system creating bias or mitigating bias in terms of how people who are using your systems relate to it? Specifically things like recruiting systems, for example, or even performance management systems, or even surveys in which you're gathering data and so forth. It can target communities inappropriately. How many of you are familiar with Cambridge Analytica? And how many of you are familiar with what they did to help provide information about the election, or at least people's attitudes and so forth? So that type of system is beginning to find its way into the workplace, and in terms of the beliefs, ideologies, and so forth that people have about each other. And what we're finding is that we're seeing more of these systems being focused on emotional responses, how an emotional response can be generated, rather than fact-based research, data, and information. So we're entering a new environment. When I started my career in HR many years ago, you could control through your corporate affairs group, your HR department, much of the messaging, the branding, and so forth, but your brand is impacted in today's environment instantaneously in many ways, positively and negatively, as you can see with some of the things that we've seen recently with Google and Starbucks and so forth. So, but one of the things that is very encouraging, I guess I should say, is that technology can improve HR inclusivity. How many of you have thought about HR and inclusivity and HR systems? HR leaders are looking at behaviors in the workplace, you're looking at practices in the workplace, and you're looking at systems and policies and so forth. And if your systems, if your practices, if your behaviors are not inclusive, they can impact how you are trying to perform and the kinds of outcomes that you get. So technology, in a way, can help you in many respects. Who can give me an example of a way technology is enhancing your own business results in your company? Just one example. You can just shout it out. Broadens the pool of prospective new hires, exactly. Any others, just quickly? It can help make things much more transparent, exactly. So I just want to say, it can reduce bias in recruitment. We talked just about that. How can technology help to reduce bias in recruitment? Exactly, just in terms of how people are reviewing resumes and so forth. Even the whole issue of redacting information on resumes. There are systems now that allow you to take out information that might cause you, based on a bias you have, to respond to that resume in a particular way based on your past beliefs and behaviors and experiences and so forth. So it's a very important one. Even reinforcing positive images. How does technology do that? Just a question. You know, it's just how you're portraying information in your ads, in your branding, and so forth. Is it portraying an atmosphere of inclusivity or not? I mean, so you have to think about how diversity, how equity, how inclusion is being portrayed in the various forms and venues that you share information. Biases can be programmed into practice. Who are the technologists in here? How can biases be programmed into technology? Human training. What exactly? Any other ideas or suggestions? How is bias, or how can it be programmed into practice? By the people who are programming it, right? If you do not have a diverse set of programmers, you may in fact be programming it based on a particular ideology or cultural background and so forth, right? And if you have more diversity in terms of the people that are programming your systems and applications, it's likely that you'll screen out or you'll rule out a lot of the bias that comes into play. If you have a less diverse team, a much more homogeneous team, the likelihood that you'll be screening in more bias is significant here. Any other ideas around how that might happen with those of you who are in HR or in technology? Exactly. That's a very good example of bots and how bots can be programmed, and how bots in some ways, I think there was at Microsoft, there was a bot called Tay a couple of years ago, right? And that it started to develop a mind of its own in some respects. So those are the kinds of ways that bias can, in fact, come into practice. Psychographics. How many are familiar with psychographics and how organizations are using that to identify trends and practices and desires and so forth? This is another area, and so I know is my time up. It's just really, really thinking about how that comes into play. And then finally, machine learning, and we've heard a lot about that. Are areas in which you don't think about the implications for diversity and inclusion. So the thing that I would just leave you with in terms of technology and HR applications is that if you don't think intentionally about asking the questions about how are these systems being designed, who's programming them, and what kinds of people do you have that are part of the teams, it could work to your disadvantage, or it could create more bias in those systems because you don't have people challenging certain perspectives and points of view. The message in the end is really that HR, the 21st century, has to think about how these systems are going to help you enable a much more inclusive culture and climate in your organization. Because if they don't, you know, they could work against you, they could work against your brand and so forth. And so that's all I wanted to say here today to you today, is to think about how technology, how HR, and how diversity, equity, and inclusion come together in terms of how you're moving the profession forward. Thank you.